In January of 2010, a woman named Grace Groner died in the small town of Lake Forest, Illinois. She was 100 years old. She left behind a single-room cottage barely larger than a generous garage, a closet of clothes that she had bought for decades at church rummage sales, and a set of financial documents that the people who handled her estate would describe as almost impossible to believe. On those documents was a single company. One. Not 100 names, not 200 certificates. One. Abbott Laboratories, the pharmaceutical company headquartered a short drive from her cottage. And the holding, grown across 75 years from a tiny original purchase, swollen by decade after decade of stock splits and reinvested dividends, came to roughly $7 million. Grace Groner had never married. She had never inherited money. She had never run a business, sold a house, or won anything. She worked as a clerk and secretary at Abbott Laboratories for 43 years. Her salary was modest the entire time. She retired on it and then lived almost 3 more decades on very little. And yet, in her quiet, almost invisible way, across 3/4 of a century of simply not selling, she built a fortune large enough to send Lake Forest students around the world, year after year, long after she was gone, from 3 shares of stock, with nobody watching. This is the story of how she did it, and what it can teach the rest of us. Grace Groner was born in 1909 in rural Lake County, Illinois. She had a twin sister, Gladys. When the girls were 12 years old, both of their parents died within a short span of each other, and Grace and Gladys were left orphans. They were taken in by a man named George Anderson, a prominent local figure who saw that the twins were housed, clothed, and educated. It was an act of generosity that shaped the rest of Grace Groner's life, and, much later, the lives of strangers she would never meet. Grace never forgot what it meant to be a child with nothing, lifted up by someone who chose to help. She carried that memory for 90 years. Grace and her sister attended Lake Forest College, a small school in their town, and graduated in 1931. It was the depth of the Great Depression. Jobs were scarce, money was frightening, and an entire generation was learning, the hard way, exactly how thin the ground beneath an ordinary life could be. Grace found work at Abbott Laboratories, the pharmaceutical company based nearby in north suburban Chicago. She took a job as a secretary. She would keep that job, in one form or another, for 43 years. She never sought a corner office. She never angled for a promotion into management. She did her work, carefully and well, and she went home. She bought a small house, and later moved into an even smaller one, a one-room cottage in Lake Forest that a friend had left to her. She did not own a car for much of her life. She walked, or she accepted rides. She kept the same plain habits she had formed as a Depression orphan, and she kept them for 100 years. She did not consider any of this a hardship. It was simply the size of life she wanted. She never married. She had a wide circle of friends, a deep attachment to her town and her college, and a lifelong habit of giving quietly to people in trouble. Neighbors knew her as a cheerful, sociable, frugal old woman who walked everywhere and never seemed to want for company. Not one of them imagined what she was holding. In 1935, 4 years into her career at Abbott, Grace Groner did something small. Something that, on the day she did it, would have seemed completely unremarkable. She bought 3 shares of Abbott Laboratories stock. 3. They were what were then called specially issued shares, and they cost her about $60 apiece, roughly $180 in total. $180 in 1935 was real money to a Depression-era secretary. It was a meaningful share of her savings. But Grace worked at Abbott. She typed its correspondence. She filed its papers. She saw the company from the inside every day. She believed in it. She thought it was a sound, well-run business that made things people needed. So she bought 3 shares of the company she worked for, and she put the certificate away. And here is the entire secret of Grace Groner's fortune, stated in a single sentence. She never sold those shares. Not one of them. Not ever. Not in 75 years. She did not sell when the Second World War threw the markets into chaos. She did not sell in the long, flat stretches when Abbott's price did very little for years at a time. She did not sell in the brutal bear market of the early 1970s. She did not sell in the crash of 1987, when the market fell more than 20% in a single day. She did not sell in the dot-com collapse or in the financial crisis of 2008. Across the entire arc of the 20th century and into the 21st, Grace Groner simply held 3 shares of Abbott Laboratories. And let them work. But 3 shares, even held forever, do not become $7 million on their own. 2 quiet mechanisms did the work. The first was the stock split. The second was the reinvested dividend. And together, across 75 years, they turned $180 into a fortune. Start with the first engine. The stock split. It is one of the most ordinary events in the life of a successful company, and most people barely notice when it happens. Here is what a stock split is. When a company has done well for many years, its share price climbs. Eventually, a single share becomes expensive, awkwardly expensive for ordinary investors to buy. So the company performs a split. In a 2-for-1 split, every shareholder is simply given a second share for each one they hold, and the price of each share is halved to match. The total value does not change on the day it happens. If you owned $100 of stock before the split, you own $100 after it, just spread across twice as many shares. On the day it happens, a split feels like nothing. It changes no value at all. But follow it across decades, and something quietly powerful emerges. A genuinely excellent company does not split once. It splits again, and again, and again. Every time its price climbs back to an awkward height. And Abbott Laboratories, across the 75 years Grace Groner held it, was a genuinely excellent company. It split its stock many times over those decades. Each split multiplied her share count, and her share count, multiplied enough times, became enormous. Think carefully about what this meant for Grace. She bought 3 shares in 1935. She did nothing. She placed no further orders. She added no new money to the position. And purely through Abbott splitting its stock, decade after decade, those 3 shares multiplied themselves into many thousands of shares. Grace Groner did not get rich by being clever. She got rich by owning a piece of an excellent company and then living long enough and holding firmly enough for that company's success to multiply in her hands. There is a lesson buried in this that the financial press almost never tells, because it is too slow to make exciting television. You do not have to add money to a great investment for it to grow dramatically. You have to choose a genuinely excellent business, and then you have to not interfere with it. Grace Groner's 3 shares grew into thousands not because she fed the position, but because she left it completely alone, and let the company do what an excellent company does. She used to say, in her plain way, that she had simply bought a little bit of a good company and kept it. She did not think of herself as an investor. She thought of herself as a loyal Abbott employee who had backed her own company. But the discipline she showed, the discipline of buying once and then never across 75 years, allowing herself to sell, is rarer and more valuable than almost any skill on Wall Street. The second engine was the reinvested dividend, and it is the one that turned a large position into a genuine fortune. Abbott Laboratories, like most strong American companies, paid its shareholders a dividend, a regular cash payment, usually quarterly, simply for owning the stock. Grace Groner owned the stock. So every quarter, Abbott sent her cash, and Grace Groner did not spend a cent of it. She enrolled in what is called a dividend reinvestment plan, a DRIP, and instead of mailing her a check, the company automatically used every dividend to buy her still more shares of Abbott. Now watch the 2 engines run together, because this is where the arithmetic becomes remarkable. The splits kept multiplying her share count. The reinvested dividends kept buying her additional shares on top of that. More shares meant a larger dividend the next quarter. A larger dividend bought even more shares, which were themselves multiplied by the next split, which then paid an even larger dividend. Grace Groner's position was not growing in a straight line. It was feeding on itself, quarter after quarter, for 3/4 of a century. This is what people mean when they say the word compounding. It is not a slogan. It is a literal mechanism. A quantity that grows, and then grows on top of its own growth, and then grows on top of that. Stretch it across 75 years, and the final shape does not look like a slope at all. It looks like a wall. Consider the cruel and beautiful timing of it. For the first 30 or 40 years, Grace Groner's 3 shares were doing the quiet, unglamorous early work of compounding. The position grew, but slowly and invisibly. Had she checked it in 1955 or 1965, she would have seen a modest holding, nothing that looked like wealth. The fortune did not arrive evenly across her life. It arrived almost entirely at the end, in the last 2 or 3 decades, and it arrived only because she was still holding when it did. The investors who sell in year 20 never see year 50. Grace saw year 75. To make the scale concrete, a single original purchase in a company that compounds at a strong long-term rate, with dividends reinvested and shares split repeatedly, has time on its side in a way that is genuinely hard to imagine. Money invested this way roughly doubles every several years. Doubling and doubling and doubling for 3/4 of a century. Grace Groner spent decades feeding a machine that gave her nothing visible in return. She watched no growing balance with pleasure. She drew no income from it. She simply did not touch it. And in the final stretch of a 100-year life, the machine she had refused to interrupt turned into $7 million. None of this would have been possible without the third element of Grace Groner's life, the one that made the holding survivable. She lived dramatically, almost startlingly, below her means. Her home for the last decades of her life was a 1-room cottage in Lake Forest, a small structure left to her by a friend. 1 room. She did not move to something larger when her stock would easily have allowed it. She did not redecorate. She did not upgrade. She bought her clothes at church rummage sales and second-hand shops. She did not own a car for much of her life. She simply walked to where she was going. She heated a small space, cooked simple food, and asked the world for very little. Look closely at the largest expense in most people's lives, and at what Grace Groner did with hers. For nearly everyone, housing is the heaviest cost they carry, and it is a cost that tends to climb. People move to larger homes as their income rises. They pay more, furnish more, maintain more. Housing, for most people, is the expense that quietly grows to swallow every gain. Grace simply refused to let it grow at all. 1 room, for decades, and every dollar that a larger life would have demanded was a dollar that never had to come out of her Abbott shares. This is the part of the story that people find hardest to absorb. Grace Groner was, for the last several decades of her life, a multimillionaire. And she lived, by free and deliberate choice, exactly as she had lived as a young Depression-era secretary. The number on the statement grew into the millions. Her life did not change at all. Not the cottage, not the rummage sale coats, not the walking. To Grace, the fortune was never money to spend on herself. It was something else entirely. And we will come to what it was. Now, we should be honest about this, the way we are honest in every story on this channel. Grace Groner had no children to raise and no spouse to support. Her costs were genuinely lighter than most people's, and we are not pretending otherwise. We are not arguing that you should live in a single room or buy all your clothes second-hand. But the principle beneath her frugality is universal, and it is this. The gap between what Grace earned and what Grace spent stayed wide and open for her entire life. It never closed. It never narrowed. And that gap is the only reason the 3 shares were never disturbed, because she never once needed to reach for them. We tend to assume that a fortune, once it is large enough, naturally improves the daily life of the person who holds it. Grace Groner's 1-room cottage is the quiet proof that this is a choice, not a law. She had $7 million, and she lived, by her own free decision, as though she had almost nothing. Because the money, to her, was never meant for her own comfort at all. To understand Grace Groner, you have to set aside the picture of the grim, isolated miser. She was nothing of the kind. Grace was, by every account, a cheerful, sociable, deeply loved woman. She had a wide circle of friends. She traveled, modestly, carefully, but genuinely, and saw a good part of the world. She was active in her community and devoted to Lake Forest College, the small school that had educated her and her orphan sister during the Depression. She was not hoarding her life away in misery. She had simply uncoupled, almost completely, the idea of happiness from the idea of spending. And here is the detail that defines her. Almost nobody in her life knew about the money. Her friends knew a frugal old woman who walked everywhere and shopped at rummage sales. They did not know she was worth $7 million. She did not tell them. She did not behave as though it were true. There was no change in her car, her clothes, her cottage, or her manner that could have given it away. For decades, Grace Groner was a quiet multimillionaire, walking, unnoticed, through her own small town. She also did not manage all of it entirely alone. Over the decades, she had relationships with the people who helped quietly steward such things, the professionals who held her records, tracked the splits, processed the reinvestment, and would eventually carry out her wishes. We say this in every episode of this channel because it matters. The image of the lone genius doing everything in total isolation is not the model. The decision was always Grace's. The buy in 1935 was hers. The refusal to sell across 75 years was hers. But she had trusted, competent people to keep the paperwork clean and the plan on course. There is one more habit of hers worth naming, because it is the seed of everything that came after her death. Throughout her long life, Grace Groner gave quietly to people in trouble. A neighbor short on rent, a young person who needed help with a bill. She did it without announcement and without expectation. The same instinct that had once been shown to her, the orphan child taken in and educated by a man who simply chose to help, she carried forward, quietly, for 90 years. Her fortune, when it was finally revealed, was not a break from her character. It was the largest possible expression of it. If you wanted to summarize what made it possible for Grace Groner to compound $7 million from 3 shares of stock, you could do worse than this list. 1 excellent company, 1 purchase, a 1-room cottage, a closet of rummage sale coats, and 75 years of absolutely refusing to sell. Grace Groner died in January of 2010, at the age of 100. She left behind no spouse and no children. What she left behind was a fortune of roughly $7 million and a set of instructions that revealed, at last, what the entire 75-year hold had been for. Years before her death, Grace had quietly created a foundation, and she directed that her entire fortune, the whole $7 million, flow into it. The foundation had a single, focused purpose. It would fund Lake Forest College students, the students of the same small school that had taken in 2 orphan Depression-era twins and given them an education. The money would pay for scholarships, for study abroad, for internships, for experiences that students from modest families could not otherwise afford. When the news broke, the town and the college were stunned. The cheerful, frugal old woman who had walked everywhere and shopped at rummage sales had just left her small college one of the largest gifts in its history. $7 million. From a secretary. From 3 shares of stock. She had told almost no one for 75 years that such a thing was even possible. Think about the shape of this decision. Grace Groner had been an orphan, lifted out of nothing by a stranger's generosity and a small college's open door. She could not repay the man who had taken her in. He was long gone. But she could make sure that the same door stayed open, wider and more generous than ever, for every orphan and every struggling student who came after her. The fund she created has, in the years since, sent students of modest means to study on 6 continents. Young people who, like a young Grace, could never have afforded the world, have seen it. On the compounded strength of 3 shares she bought in 1935. She had no children to inherit her wealth. She had no family business to pass down. But she had a purpose, formed clearly enough to put into a legal document, and she gave 75 years of patient compounding entirely to that purpose. She wanted the open door that had once saved her to stay open, permanently, for the children who came next. Now, what does Grace Groner's story actually teach us? Lesson 1. Buy excellence and then do nothing. Grace Groner's entire investment career was a single purchase, 3 shares of one outstanding company, followed by 75 years of deliberate inaction. She did not trade, she did not adjust, she did not rebalance, react, or improve. Most investors lose money not through one disaster, but through 1,000 small interferences. Grace's edge was the discipline to choose well once and then to leave her choice completely alone for the rest of her life. Lesson 2. Let the splits and the dividends do the heavy lifting. Grace Groner did not become wealthy by adding money to her position. She added almost nothing after 1935. Her fortune was built entirely by 2 forces working inside the investment itself: the company splitting its stock again and again, and the dividends being automatically reinvested into still more shares. Switch on automatic dividend reinvestment, choose a company or a fund that genuinely compounds, and the machine does not need you to keep feeding it. It needs you to keep your hands off it. Lesson 3. Time is the multiplier. Grace Groner held for 75 years. Not 7, not 17, 75. That is the single ingredient her result most depended on, and it is the one ingredient that cannot be bought, borrowed, or rushed. You can increase your savings next month. You can choose a better investment tomorrow. But you cannot add years to the start of your record. The earliest years are worth the most, because they are the ones that get multiplied the longest. This is why the most expensive financial decision most people ever make is the decision to wait. Grace did not wait. She bought in year 1 and gave the rest of a 100-year life to the holding. Lesson 4. Quiet beats loud. Grace Groner told almost no one what she was holding. She gave no interviews. She did not seek admiration for her discipline while she practiced it. For 75 years, the people around her had no idea. The discipline required to hold an investment for 3/4 of a century is in large part the discipline of not needing anyone to know. If you require an audience to confirm that you are winning, you will eventually make a loud move to prove it. And loud moves, in investing, are almost always the wrong moves. Lesson 5. Have a circle. Grace Groner made every important decision herself, but she did not execute alone. She had trusted professionals who held her records, tracked her splits, and carried out her final wishes. A great deal of personal finance advice quietly implies that you must do everything yourself in total isolation. You should not. You should keep a few honest, competent people who can hold your paperwork and steward your estate. Grace's circle did not get rich from her. They helped her execute a plan that was entirely her own. Lesson 6. Know what it's for. Grace Groner knew, for years before she died, exactly where her money was going and exactly why. She was not compounding to win a game. She was compounding to keep a door open. The same door that had once been opened for a frightened, orphan child. That clarity of purpose almost certainly made a lifetime of frugality feel not like deprivation, but like devotion. If you do not know what your wealth is ultimately for, you will spend more of it than you should, and the discipline will erode. If you do know, if the purpose is real and written down, the years of patience acquire a center of gravity that holds. But there is one more lesson in Grace Groner's life, and we should be honest about it the way we are honest in every episode. Grace's story carries a quiet risk inside its triumph. She held a single company, one. It worked. It worked spectacularly, because Abbott Laboratories happened to be an outstanding business that thrived for 75 years. But not every company does. For every Abbott, there are companies that were once admired and are now gone. Grace's concentration was rewarded, but it was also a genuine risk, and most people should not bet a whole future on one name. The modern, safer way to capture what Grace captured is to own not one excellent company, but hundreds of them at once, through a broad, low-cost index fund, and then to apply her actual genius, which was never stock-picking. Her genius was the holding. The 75 years of not selling. The country is full of Grace Groners. Quiet, cheerful, frugal people, holding their compounding tight to their chests, telling no one. Most of them will never be famous. Most of their stories will become visible, if at all, only at the very end, when an executor opens a thin folder and sits down, astonished, to count. Before we close, a practical bridge from Grace's story to your situation. Because a case study is only useful if it changes something this week. 1. Begin now with a small amount in something excellent and broad. Grace Groner's first purchase was tiny, about $180, and it changed nothing about her life on the day she made it. Its power came entirely from the years she then gave it. You do not need a large sum to begin. You need to begin, and then to give the position the one thing it cannot get later: time. 2. Own many companies, not one. Grace's concentration in a single stock happened to succeed, but it was a real gamble. You can capture the same compounding far more safely. A single, broad, low-cost, total market index fund gives you partial ownership of hundreds or thousands of strong companies at once. If any one of them fails, the others carry on. You do not need to find the next Abbott. You need to own the whole shelf and let the strongest names lift the average across the decades. 3. Switch on automatic dividend reinvestment and never switch it off. This was one of Grace Groner's 2 engines, and in a modern brokerage account, it is a single setting. Find the option labeled Automatic Dividend Reinvestment and turn it on for every position you intend to hold for the long term. Set once, forgotten forever. It is one of the most consequential and least dramatic choices of your entire investing life. 4. Build friction between yourself and the sell button. Grace Groner's defining strength was that across 75 years, she never sold. Recreate that distance on purpose. Check your portfolio rarely. Delete the app that tempts you to trade in a panic. When the next crash comes, and it will come, make selling slow and inconvenient, so that holding becomes the path of least resistance, exactly as it was for a woman with a certificate in a wooden box. 5. Decide what your wealth is for and write it down. You do not have to leave $7 million to a college. You can aim your compounding at your children, at a cause you believe in, at security for your later years, at the freedom to do work that matters. But put it on paper, make it specific and real. When you know exactly what the money is for, decades of discipline acquire a center that holds. Without that center, even a strong savings habit slowly drifts and dissolves. If you do those 5 things, even imperfectly, even slowly, you are running, on your own scale, the same program Grace Groner ran for 75 years. You will probably not arrive at $7 million from a single small purchase, but you will end up far further along than the great majority of people who out-earned you and outspent you every single year. That is the quiet promise of compound interest, proven across an entire century by an orphan secretary who bought 3 shares and never let go. Grace Groner spent the last decades of her life in a one-room cottage she never enlarged, wearing coats she bought at rummage sales, walking to where she needed to go because she chose not to keep a car. To everyone who passed her on the sidewalk, she was a cheerful, frugal old woman of very modest means. That was the visible life. It was almost entirely a disguise. Behind that disguise, a Depression-era orphan who had once owned nothing was quietly holding 3 shares of stock that she had bought in 1935 and never, across 75 years, allowed herself to sell. 1 purchase, 1 company, 75 years of patience. And when the executor finally opened the folder, he found $7 million and a single clear instruction. Keep the door open. Keep it open for the children who come next. We talk a great deal in modern personal finance about getting rich quickly, about leverage, side income, the perfect entry, the well-timed exit. All of those things have their place. But the quiet truth, the one the financial press rarely tells, because it is slow and it does not sell, is that the most reliable path to deep, durable, world-changing wealth is the one Grace Groner walked. Patient, boring, consistent, unglamorous, decade after decade after decade. Effective. If there is a North Star in this channel, a single thesis we will return to in every story, in every case study, it is this: ordinary people doing ordinary things with extraordinary patience build slow fortunes. More of them are out there right now, in small cottages and modest houses, than the world will ever notice. And the country, at its best, is shaped quietly by their hands. If you want more stories like this one, stories of ordinary, underestimated people who built extraordinary things, subscribe. There is no shortage of them. We are only getting started.